feel patterns. You feel things that are working. You feel things that are alive. Patterns in nature reflect the living intelligence of the material world. And we as designers ought to be wanting to copy that, mimic it, get in line with it, use that intelligence, become one with it, so that our designs are better informed, they're more beautiful, they fit in better. And that intelligence is rooted in our bodies. Our bodies as our senses, how we perceive, our bodies as our feelings and our intuition, which is really the other, what somebody said, we had 14, the other 8 senses that we don't have names for. We started naming some of them. I mean, I think Rupert Sheldrake said the 6th sense is the sense of being stared at. But we don't have names for the others, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Or more. We want to use all those senses. We've got them. Some of us are in touch, some of us are less in touch. We can all get better at that. Learning to use pattern involves deepening one's intuition, deepening one's access to an expression of feeling. This is where art comes into permaculture. It's not only science. We just did an issue of The Activist on science in permaculture, or permaculture in science, and I wrote a counterpoint to it at the end and said, don't forget something science doesn't know, and we know. And we have to work forward incorporating science, but also not losing what we've brought to the conversation. So we want to develop familiarity with patterns. That means we need a way to systematically understand it. And this has been my effort as a teacher, and what I'd like to share here, because it seems neglected in our culture. It's neglected in our educational system. We learn linear, word-based intelligence and forms of thinking. And they're powerful, but they're only half the picture. Pattern resides in our understanding of how to move about in the world, to be in our bodies, and that's primarily a right-brained intelligence. It's centered in the right brain. It's holistic. It's the kind of thing that comes forward as we encounter something new. It enables me to move around this tripod and not hit it. It enables me to scratch my ankle or recognize my mother's face. That intelligence is not rooted in the same part of the brain that controls language and discernment. It's in the part that doesn't have as quick access to language. So the challenge to us as designers is to strengthen the connection between the halves of our brains. I'm talking methodology, I'll get into it a bit more, but we need to be able to take the holistic impressions that we encounter in the world around us and give them word form as well as shape form. And then keep moving back and forth between those two as we go forward to develop a twinned understanding. It's kind of a spiral. It's an alternation, like everything healthy in nature alternates. Men and women, light and dark, aerobic and anaerobic. So we have shape and word in our minds, and they need to alternate. The beginning is not the word. The beginning was the apprehension. That's a word. The beginning was the form, or the gestalt, or the thing itself. And then we begin to describe it. And describing it then gives back over to context and to dynamic, and then it returns to become a story, and then it distills into something which is, again, the essence, but which we can deliver to someone as a picture, as a poem, as a symbol, as a name. All right, that's a lot of word wrap. What I'm interested in is showing us, this is all risky here, working with paper, but showing us some things that may be familiar. I realize those of you in the back are going to have a hard time. This will hold itself up if we can put it up higher. That's good. Yes. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. That's good. So there's visible patterns in nature. We're going to move from these into patterns in culture, but let's start with nature, since that's the beginning. And we've learned about all these patterns in our permaculture design courses. We've read about them from Bill Mollison's writing. He's probably said more about pattern than anyone else in the community, but it isn't enough. It's mostly mystified people. It mystified me for many years. Thank you, Dan. It mystified me a lot until I actually got feedback from one of my students, had the remarkable permaculture named David Edge. Yes. Presented this material to me in a PDC. So I'm sharing it. I'm passing it along with the good spirit of Samizdat. Right? Here we have powerful material passed hand to hand. This is actually a continuum. All these patterns that grow out of the core model. You've seen Milton Mollison's apple core model, string lines, growth lines, all that stuff in the designer's manual. Well, it begins with the seed, and it moves as the seed sprouts. The one becomes the two, as the Taoists say, right? So we have something that is intended to conserve energy, and it is an expression of compression. The most compact shape is the sphere. And so when we live in extreme climates as humans, we take a half sphere and put it on the ground and crawl inside and snuggle under the igloo, right? Because it conserves heat, the vital resource for survival in an extreme condition. When the seed sprouts, it sends its root down and its leaves up. We have little songs about that, right? Your arms extend out. This is extension. So whenever we need these functions, that's the point to notice, there's a function associated with every form in nature. Nature conserves, nature extends, nature distributes with the branching form so that the branch ramifies and becomes the many. And then that ramification is wrapped in a surface, and we get a sense of expansion at the edge, the lobe, the cloud form, the crown of the tree, the cauliflower, all those, right? See how this is logically, that's not the right word, organically unfolding. It's organically unfolding. I want us to get this and acknowledge it. We all know it, but for me, this was revelatory, and so I want to offer it. The expansion then begins to reverse direction and contract, or hold. And so we have the luneate form. This is our famous swale, right? Holding, retracting, retaining. More glacial moraines all over this landscape. Dunes, contours, lakes. Holding back. So retaining that form is beyond this point of expansion, holding back. And then achieving the polar opposite, if you will, of the conservation point, potentiation, the spiral. Going in and going out, like the watch spring. The power of the coiled snake, the power of the double helix in DNA to hold enormous potential, tremendous edge, and the ability to take whatever form is required. Then we devolve from this apotheosis here through the pattern of involute, the mushroom, the embryo, the brain, filling spaces, filling, swirling in streamlines, mixing Ekman spirals, von Karman trails. Oscillation. Oscillation is already implied here with simpler waveforms. Now lay them crossways with each other and we have the net, which stabilizes. When you want to hold something down, you want to trap a wild animal, you want to intercept snow before it crosses the highway, you put up a net, a fence. And finally, this breaks into the scatter, which diffuses and disperses energy. The seed returns to the chaotic state. All right, so this is the visible patterns in nature made into one gradient, one continuum. It's important to us to understand nature is not divided, only we divide things. So I like to be able to put it back together. Let's move on. Because pattern in nature is only the beginning. These are important and they give a set of shapes Forms that follow function and that provide and meet function elegantly. So we've talked about the ramifying pathway in gardens, and minimizing distance of path, and maximizing surface area of growing bed. And all these practical applications grow out of this, the herb spiral and all that. We have a million clever manifestations of this. But these are quite simple, and what we want to go beyond is to see patterns as recurring forms of energy. We see patterns as edges. We see patterns as the signs left by energy moving through media, through living systems, through communities. Like the boulder fields after the glacier retreats, the wavy patterns of silt on the parking lot after the flood has withdrawn. We see patterns everywhere as edges. So you notice patterns by seeing edges. And those edges have to grow beyond the physical, because we're social beings and we create environments that aren't found otherwise in nature. They grow out of our needs to socialize and structure our environment. We have patterns in all of that too. We have patterns in our music, we have patterns in the way we congregate, circles, swirls, a lot of patterns were happening out this morning. More sophisticated patterns emerge as we watch recurrent phenomena in culture. And one of the beginning of this whole discussion, I'm sure many of you know of the work of Christopher Alexander and his colleagues, who wrote and gave us a name for this process of integrating the two halves of the brain and understanding forms as a language that gives rise to many potential designs. So this was the first hyperlinked, or example of hyperlinked media that I'm aware of. It was preceded the internet, and yet you go into it and you can move around through it sideways. Follow your lateral thinking and your interests. What this represents is a collection, the first collection, but only the first, of a series of cultural patterns. What we want to recognize, and why I want to talk about languages here a little bit, is that what are they, pattern languages? The most important letter or word in this title is the first one. First one, A. Not all, not the, but A. There go the notes. It's only one of many. They make this explicit in the text. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So we are obliged, if we take this material seriously, and it was written the year before Permaculture 1, so it's contemporary. And I know from reading The Nature of Order, Alexander's recent work, that he's acknowledged permaculture openly. It was thrilling to discover that. So we need to pick up the other end of this conversation. We're part of it. We need to write pattern languages. So I've been making my students do this for 10 years. And I would encourage us all to think about how this can strengthen our design understanding. Pattern languages are integrative design methods. They're holistic and they reflect a body of cultural knowledge. We're moving into an era of energy descent or lower energy availability, in which more conservative patterns and forms will reemerge in society, in culture, and in all the things we make. And so as designers, we've been trained to cultivate or to seek out the aims and desires of clients and to help meet those and consistent with the requirements of land. We're going to find more and more that design aims descend into long-established creodes or valleys of repetition in manifestation. We're going to be seeking out those conservative forms in culture and aligning people to them. being helpful. Part of what I think we're about is shoehorning our present energy-intensive culture into a smaller box as gracefully as we can. Oh, really, it'll be fun. Let's just get closer together. That's the message. You have to put a good spin on it, but that's still the message. And that closer box requires certain recognition of certain forms. So we want to take hold of ways to get at what they are. Here's Alexander's take on this, or my reading of Alexander's take on what pattern languages are. It's a design approach to culture. He writes about site repair and entrance transition and things from your life and compost and animals and quiet backs and subculture boundaries and a whole panoply of fascinating patterns in culture. His theses are that we need to reclaim a different paradigm that honors the earth, that's holistic, universal, and non-dual, that's body-centered. He and his colleagues have developed a body-centered architecture. They say you can't build a building unless you first go to the site, walk around and feel where the corners need to be, and the front door, and each window. And if you don't put yourself and your body and your feelings into those places, the building will be flawed. You can't build it on a drawing board. You'll make drawings later, but they come later. The beginning is in the body. So it's a body-centered architecture, and I want us to do body-centered design for landscape and culture, informed by and supportive of urban civilization. So a lot of what he wrote about was for the city, in the city context, which means he's left whole vast swaths of the countryside, rural life, home life, and other things undeveloped. That's for us to do. That's work that we can do. To write those chapters, to write those languages. Environments, he asserts, and we assert too, are shaped by recurring events. So patterns are things that are both memorable in form and that recur. The method that he lines out and that we can learn from is to make a cultural problem statement, or to recognize a cultural problem and give it an environmental pattern solution. Sound familiar? Turn problems into solutions. Indicating practical consequences. Languages consist of nested assemblies of patterns, starting from the larger scope to the smaller, And it's modeled on language. That is, we can reassemble the pieces of the language to make different statements, just like we can put words together differently to say different meanings. But it's morphological and not symbolic. It's rooted in forms that we can see, touch, and access with the senses, with the body. All right. Where does it fit? This is new. No, this is yeah, I'll expand this a moment. Yeah, let's go here. I told you I was winging this, so don't be surprised by anything. Pattern languages, this integrative design method that we are helping to develop, reflect a body of cultural knowledge. They help to shape design themes and identify the elements that belong in the design. And I'll tell you where this comes into our design process, and I'll expand on that in a minute. It comes in at the concept and vision stage, and it supports that, and it's iterative. So it feeds into the center of the hourglass. If the hourglass represents all the data gathering above and all the design details below, the narrow waist, the tough spot, the hard place, the job that got your design team sweating in your course was to come up with the vision and concept, that crystallization of the essence of the thing. Pattern languages help get us through that bottleneck because they show what belongs together, and they've already done a lot of the streamlining. So they'll identify the elements. When we have a successful language, a demonstrated language, and we're always working on them, building them up, that'll have elements. That one of the hardest things in a design is to see what's not there. You know, you can go and do just site observation and say, oh, this is here and this is here and this could be better and that's broken and so forth. But how do you see what's not there? The missing shadow pieces, the stuff that was eroded away 2 generations back, that needs to be restored, whether it's the heart or the barn or the, you know, the road in the right way. You don't know until you've felt it, and the pattern languages can help you find those elements that are missing and put them into the design. Patterns distill prior experience. That's why they're useful. Just as we work with guilds rather than individual plants, we work with familiar assemblies, we nest plants according to size, we coordinate functions. Patterns distill prior experience into units that we can grasp and lay together. So to generate patterns, there's a method. Patterns need a title, they need a problem statement, they need a little reasoning and some evidence, a solution, and usually a sketch. That's what gives pattern its manifestation. Once we've got it, once we understand it, of course, if we handle it by its title. We just say site repair, because it encompasses all that meaning, just like we use words. They become almost symbolic in that sense. But at the beginning, when you're trying to shape a pattern, you need to give it a title. You need to hang it on something. And those titles, looking at the successful patterns, are typically 1 to 5 words. They're not lengthy statements. There's something a bit poetic. They have resonance. They're expressive. They have qualities and feelings embedded in them. The problem statement means, where are we going to apply the pattern? What do we have to keep doing? If we have to get from the inside of a building to the outside of a building, there's a process involved. Typically, every problem will be a process in culture. It might be quite a simple one, like moving through a doorway, which is actually not simple. I discovered this when my mother was dying of Parkinson's disease. Her world narrowed down very intensively, and going through a doorway was like this kind of a process, because it required so many mental, efforts to see and change the state one was in. Alexander and his colleagues recognized that in their work and say, you need a transition for entrances. They call the pattern entrance transition. In other words, you expand that space in which you have to do all those complicated things to get through a doorway. A naked doorway and a naked wall is horrifying. It's horrifying. But a doorway with a foyer and a porch and seats and columns and a sweeping approach, this is meant to salve the heart and calm the soul. So that's how we should enter and leave our buildings. This is a common thing. We do it all the time. And how many times is it done well? And notice too that the pattern here is describing form. It's describing the way the architect, the builder, is shaping a space to solve a problem recurring, a recurrent problem. All right, so we need a problem statement that defines the place of application. How do we use this pattern? Where do we put it to work? And then we need a little reasoning, such I've just walked you through very roughly. And then we need a solution. And the solution needs to be declarative. It needs to take a bold stance. It needs to say, do these things in this way. And it needs to recognize practical limits. Not more than 15 feet high and 3 feet wide, and typically right? But it doesn't say exactly how every application will be, so that you can do it in your own way, context sensitive, wherever you're working. And then make a rough sketch that kind of gives the shape. Declarative statement indicating practical limits. So this is how you write a pattern. For many of us, coming to terms with pattern in languages means borrowing familiar and unfamiliar patterns and then learning to use them. But there comes a time when you find something's missing, you need to describe a phenomenon. A colleague of mine at Earth Haven, a young man who worked a lot outdoors, named a pattern I hadn't seen. He said, the garden needs an eye, and he gave it an old Roman name, oculus. The garden needs an eye. I think you'll recognize what I'm talking about, because this is a place from which the gardener scans the terrain and understands it and orients to where it might be simply the place in the middle where the watering can sits. But that's a real place, and it's a really important function that needs to be shaped appropriately and included. And most people wouldn't name that, hadn't named that. Right? Sometimes it masks itself under other names, the garden shed or something, which isn't the same. You're not in the shed when you're doing this function. It's an outdoor space. But it's a key space, a key point in the garden. All the energies and orientations of the garden close in on it. They gather together, so it's a nexus. And if you don't recognize that it has to exist and don't take account of where it should be, then the garden will not be so successful. You will not be so successful in it. So this is the point of having pattern literacy, borrowing Toby's wonderful term. The ability to articulate patterns, to group them together, to know when they're in an appropriate sequence, to know what's missing, to draw it in. The languages link the patterns into design wholes. And they're larger wholes than we typically need for any given design. That's why they're languages. A language is both larger and smaller than what it is we're immediately focusing on when we're making some statements, when we're building something. We want to know because the language will incorporate the context of that building and all of its details. And as designers, we're probably coming in the middle and trying to place that thing and show people how to work with it, build it, but not necessarily all the things about how to live in it. Those are part of the language of that building too. So, where are we? Let's try something else. Let's talk about the design process so that we who are familiar with design process can know how and when appropriately to apply pattern language understanding. So this lacks only the hourglass, and I thought about how I might put it in a dashed line. So it's a busy poster. Observation is the beginning. This is meant to draw your eye here in red at the top. But it rests on existing sectors information from nature, what's coming to the site, elevations given by the topography, existing patterns in nature, and the scale of permanence. We've learned from Yeomans and Jackie that begins with climate and then moves to landform, water, legal issues, and so on, winds up with aesthetics. The scale of permanence is orderly thinking and design. So these precede observation. We bring them in. We carry them with us. They shape our minds. We gather data from the site and from other sources, published and otherwise. We talk to people. We interview the client. We look for key points. We find the flows and storages of the ecosystem we're looking at so we can begin to map it as a living system. We look for its characteristics, and its opportunities, what's surplus, what's waste, what's the yield, what's possible. This is the what, Dave Jackie's terminology, the what and the so what. The analysis is next. Once you have the data, you have to start shuffling it together, stacking it up, putting it in gradients, putting it in categories, seeing what contradicts what. You do your analysis and assessment. And then from that, somehow you're supposed to make the magical leap toward understanding the whole thing. This is where I think pattern languages come in. We have to derive a vision and then a concept for the design. This is the bottleneck of the hourglass, the hard place, where all the data has spiraled down into orderly streams that meet perfectly and to some crystalline light flashes on vision. Well, that might or might not be available to us. Some of us are, pretty good and in touch with intuition. Some of us can hear the voices of the ancestors when we walk the land, and that's marvelous, wonderful.
Why don't we start with vision? starting with vision.
You do. You open your eyes.
Why am I here?
You do. You open your eyes. But I think it's presumptuous to say, to walk into a space and, I have a vision of what I want here. That's the multi-million-dollar Hollywood producer. My purpose as a designer is to assist the healing of the land and the community. So that's my vision, but it's for my life and not for the site. So when I say vision, I'm talking about a particular context of something that's to be reborn or regenerated. And it isn't immediately available. It might be. It might be. If you can start with that, glory be. More power to you. That can then lead you like, a team of horses right through the whole work. But it may not come immediately. And so what I'm offering and what we teach is a systematic way to get toward it and to let it emerge. But again, there's a gap. And I feel that pattern languages begin to close that gap between data and vision. That they give us a sense of what the thing is or might be. And then what are its parts? That's where we have to accept that we exist in a continuum of culture and claim that which has gone before. This book, which launched the discussion, is really saying the timeless way of building existed before us and goes on after us. Let's get with it. It generates these environments. The timeless way is centered in the body. It's centered in this whole body-mind understanding. So, as we would want to bring in aims or define aims, how do we refine, make goal statements about the design? What are the aims of the design? What's it supposed to do? Based on this vision, pattern languages can help us balance out the idiosyncratic with the cultural normative, or the enduring cultural values distilled into a body of knowledge. And then once we have developed the concept, we can draw out of the languages the elements that fill it out and organize it, and then place them in the right niches to facilitate flows and storages of energy in the appropriate zones, recognizing sectors and elevations. So again, iterative, or reiterative. Then we go into details and so on. Placement, timing, process, costs, sources, succession, development, phases, synergies, limits, problems, maintenance, yields, evaluation, and incremental design ongoing. This is the key place. If we don't have the language for the thing which we're trying to create, we have to somehow cobble it together. We have to borrow it from existing patterns or languages. We have to write patterns based on what recurs in the system, based on what recurs in the landscape and in the culture. When we begin to think about this, it can be overwhelming because we're trying to apply words to things that we normally don't put words to. But every moment of every day, we are operating in patterned manners. Most of them unconscious at this point, habits learned and developed and carried on. Some of them are profound and necessary, and some of them are simply the flim-flam of our lives. We need to be able to sort out as designers those which are essential, necessary, and basic to our humanity and to a healthy living planet, and put them together in collections of patterns that form languages for designing new and regenerative environments. So I did some of this. I made a scratching towards some of this in my book, the Garden Farming Handbook, Permaculture Handbook, and I've used some of those patterns for what I call the home system, what some of us call home system in permaculture, the domestic economy, which is a bit of a redundancy. The economy means the household. So the household economy is the root of the economy, and it's one of the key strategies in permaculture So I began to name or borrow and find some of these patterns that shape the household economy elegantly. The first two being a home of one's own, which is from Alexander et al. You can't change a house unless you own it. And if you can't change it, you're stuck with somebody else's design, and it's probably bad. So you've got to somehow get sovereignty in the home. And then that home has to be oriented to the dominant climate elements, or sheltering in the sun, for most of us in cooler climates. Not just Minnesota, but farther south as well. And shaping the space around the house into south-facing outdoors. The more useful space is that which is oriented to the sun, especially where the sun is a limiting factor, or heat is a limiting factor. These begin to tell us how the relationship of the dwellers to the space, and of the space of the buildings to the elements. Then, speaking to the economy, I've called it household provision, or we call it self-reliance. Meeting your own needs primarily first from right around you. And what supports that? Well, we have such a plethora of livelihoods today. You could say what supports that is my iPhone, or my office, or my employer, or my car, or da-da-da-da-da. But thinking long-term, what supports the household economy are places to store fuel, energy, allies, animals, to manipulate things and store tools, to meet with those who are intimate and exchange the learnings about the system, what I call the family table. It's not just about the food, it's the conversation. It's the sharing and the heart at the center. These are critical supports for the household economy. This is where you regulate it. This is where you do the work. If you don't have some of these simple structures as patterns and elements in the system, you can't really do much. So to take the suburban setting and turn it into something economical, you need to add in some of these elements. Well, on it goes. And so we talk about water and outdoor rooms, the spaces, storage of food. These are storage organs in the body of the household economy. The root cellar, the pantry, the function of food storage, and all those things with it. Right? I mean, you got an ecosystem, it stores energy. Where does it store the energy? If the household is an ecosystem, it stores energy. And it stores energy in woodsheds, and in root cellars, and in animals on the hoof, and intelligence and love at the table. And it nurtures us, and in watering tanks and landscapes. Am I making any sense? Yeah. Is this example useful? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I would like to invite comments and questions. I've said a lot, and it's been pretty heady. What do you want to know, need to know, or think about this? Roxanne.
I love what you're talking about in terms of the edges, and what I see here is a pattern in your conferences, some of the invisible emerging, and a piece that I look to is it's very, very difficult to language the mystery, and sometimes, and I'm hearing you talk about this, Peter, is trying to find a way to connect with that mystery, and sometimes you lose it in the language. So cultivating and trusting, stepping into mystery is part of discerning pattern, and it's been juicy for me over the years to do that, and thank you for bringing that forward in terms of
some of us, and Haggard has written about this, other people have written about it in many ways, have sought doorways to the dream world in terms of design. How do you go into a space and listen to what's happening? How do you get that vision?
So I have a question related to exactly this. This is what you might call the visible part of this. Can you go, now that you have this, how are you choosing to feel into that next layer?
Right. What I want to suggest is that we can take the visible, and if we name it right, and if we conceive it correctly, it's loaded with the invisible. And I think this is a good example. We know what that means, right? But it's already relational. And it's already rich and piled, heaping bowls of steaming food and slices of pie. And love and glances and fights. Ben?
Just a concept that might help with that is the idea of liminality, which is the liminality is like that fine space between left brain and right brain, or awake and sleep, or consciousness and subconsciousness. But a question that really set up for me is you talked in the beginning about how we actually understand and perceive patterns mostly with the right brain, the non-rational part of our self.
Holistic form.
So, and then in one of your posters up here, you gave us a list of the things that when we turn a pattern into when we encode it into language, it has a list of things that it needs. So my question is, the language is a left brain thing. It's very functional. It's very rational. When we encode a pattern into language and we pass that language on to other people to use, how do we minimize the possibility that that the language itself will lose the essence of the pattern, since they're such different things?
Yeah, entropy, languages are subject to entropy too. And yet, they endure. We can still read Chaucer and Shakespeare, yes, and they speak to us. It's possible. And it's possible by choosing few words well. I believe that's the essence. And incorporating those which are redolent with meaning. That doesn't guarantee perfect replication, but the pattern doesn't require it either. The pattern requires that there be an energetic nexus around which many things congregate, right? So we're aiming for that nexus. The best shot we can get will get right in toward the bullseye. But if we're on the target somewhere, people will recognize it because it has its own attractor. Once they begin to try to manifest it, they'll come to understand it, and the form pieces will reemerge because they were never lost. They're there. That's what I feel. I mean, I don't know.
Observation, Peter. I've taught landscape design for 35 years. I've used pattern language to work for 33 of those years. You mentioned there are critical patterns, and then there's bigger and little. What I found is when you're starting a design process, you use between 5 and 7 of the critical patterns because they expand so much. If you try to do more, you get confused. It's easier to have a vision.
That's great. I've been giving my students the assignment to write a chapter for their designs using 8 to 12. So I've set a limit. I recognize that too many is confusing and too few are an inadequate expression. That's a good piece of working guide. Seth?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. I mean, I've been, from your book, I've been like trying to figure this out for about a year now, and you're totally working so on, and getting to understand more and more, and understand both the example side and the theoretical side. I just want to go back to the example side. Like, patterns can be physical spaces. They can be schedules in time.
It's true.
They can be behaviors that we engage in. What are the things, like what are the kind of categories of patterns do you look at? Or is there a way, is that a question I can ask?
Some people, there's a whole set of work now emerging that's, this book's 8 years old. It's called Liberating Voices, edited by Douglas Schuler. Maybe some of you have found it. It's called the publicsphereproject.org on the web. 138 patterns for communication. I don't think they're nearly as elegant as Alexander's, but they're modeled in much the same way, and they're important because they explore this whole emerging and necessary realm of invisible structures and communication. I'm challenged by it and also attracted to it in part because we need to go there. We need patterns for invisible structures, and I think they'll come. The community's working on it right now in a certain way. I've been challenged in my own work. My readers, some of my colleagues who read my work and said, okay, that's good work. I really like what you've done. Here are some suggestions. I've been trying to add patterns into the language for garden farming. Ian Graham has suggested that we need a pattern. Well, he modified fencing to be fencing and gates, and I did that in the second printing. And he also said we need a library and we need seed bank, which are good. And I've become aware that we need something that I call monitoring. But he didn't like that, so he said to me, that's just behavioral. I mean, that's really hard. So I thought about that. We could call that circuit of signs and instruments, which is what I do when I go around and I read the power meter, and I pick up the rain gauge, and I check the pumps, and I look at the state of bloom of something in the orchard or the number of fruits ripe on a tree. We make a circuit and we incorporate that in our daily activities. I don't know quite yet. I'm still working on things like that. I hope other people are working on similar ways to express and distill the essential organs of a functioning permaculture system. The suburban or garden, small farm setting is one setting. I think it's a broad path down the middle of our current society. It's available to many people, not everyone. But we need patterns in the urban setting because they're very different. The architecture is different. The sharings are different. We need patterns in invisible realms, organizational realms. Adam.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to foreground that you're just bringing up, Peter, is that I feel a really important part of this pattern language concept is that they're living, breathing entities, and I think it kind of speaks to what Ben was asking about too, of this challenge of liminality and translating this kind of inherent stuff that we all know in our bones into words, is that we're continuously figuring it out and feeling it out. And a pattern language is never complete, just like the English language is never complete, or music as a language is never complete. So it's this continual kind of iterative process of revision and rehashing, and one person might continuously revise their own language that works just for them, and then share it with other people, and they might add to it. But I think it helps us to think about pattern languages as a process of development, rather than like this kind of tablet of patterns that are handed down to us from Alexander or our teachers or whoever. But I think studying the ones that have been existing and then kind of continuously adding to them and revising to them is probably a better way of looking at it.
I want to pick up on the word you used, process, because I think it's a key to helping us understand and identify and shape patterns, because patterns reflect an energetic process, something that recurs. They're the container. What we see are the forms and edges that are left behind, or that regulate the flow of energy, but we have to be able to notice the energy flows, or the process, developmental processes. So these can be very slow. I mean, in succession of forests, they can be 250 years. In the development of the human organism, they can be decades, right? So we want to be able to recognize them at whatever frequency they're happening. Sometimes they're very quick, influx of a swarm of insects. But the patterns help to shape and regulate those flows. And the good design has patterns placed like the jewels in a watch to make the design tick in balance and keep moving in the way it needs to. Right?
Really, you're talking about setting up your recurring pattern structures within each climate ecosystem, urban, rural. But the challenge, as we infiltrate into different ecosystems and readapt back to those ecosystems, is being able to go back to that left side of the brain, which I think you get into the contemplative traditions that really help with that process, to be able to go back into the unknown and translate it back into this limitations of, which I think permaculture does an excellent job of being able to bring in those zone sectors, the elemental factors that then create life again. So, and being able to develop that pattern and structure it properly, but it's really going between those zones as we readapt back to our ecosystems, and also bringing in existing old traditions as well that have worked for a long time.
Mollison wrote about placing translators at edges, and I think often those are key places where we need to name the patterns and place the elements. The shamans, yes.
That would be dancing between those spaces and that role.
So just because a pattern is based on nature doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable. So like I think of road networks, how that could be like, you know, like arterials going to cul-de-sac housing, you know, like, so do you have any suggestions about like, just because a pattern is based on nature, separating the wheat from the chaff?
I missed a little of your first example because I couldn't hear well in the wind. Do you want to?
Yeah. So because a pattern is based on nature doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable.
Okay, and your example was?
The road networks, you know, arterials going
road
to cul-de-sac housing.
Yes.
So I think especially when students first come in, they think, oh, well, based on patterns on nature, it'll be sustainable, but it's, I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yes. I'll repeat the question. So just because patterns in the built environment or in culture seem to be based on nature, and the example was road networks and the cul-de-sac housing settlement, they may not be sustainable. Because, why? Because a little deeper energy analysis is required. They're serving the vehicle and the division of land, but not the generation of resources and the cultivation of the land and of living with the land. And so the assumptions underneath the application of that pattern are the wrong ones, so it's not sustainable. Yes, I think it's good to recognize that. Just because it's got the right shape doesn't mean that we're doing the right thing. Jason.
I feel like there's an analogy here with the term permaculture design, and that we often look at permaculture as permaculture, and then we leave off design. And similarly, we look at pattern languages and we focus on the patterns and we leave off the language. And in the language is the context of why you're using that pattern, what problem you're solving. And I think exactly what you're doing here is addressing that language part so we can see process rather than just focus on the form.
Exactly. One of the best pieces of permaculture design understanding that I've come across was written long before Permaculture 1 and 2, and I cited it in my essay in The Last Activist. Some of you may already have read it, so I apologize for repeating, but Jane Jacobs wrote about American city life in 1961 and the death and life of great American cities, and her chapter 22 is talking about methods of understanding, because we were examining science in this last issue. I wanted to provide a counterpoint to the idea that scientific method is somehow preeminent. Well, it's important, but it's not the whole thing. And she talks about process understanding. She says, to understand wholes, and she was looking at city neighborhoods and districts as living organisms, in the same way we look at farms, towns, household lots as living organisms, as ecosystems. She said for those holistic systems, we need a different kind of ways, different ways of problem solving. You can take and measure gas and heat as two variables, and you can figure out the laws of steam, and you can make an engine and set the world on fire. And that was powerful, hats off to Mr. Boyle. But that only goes so far, because living systems can't be sliced up that far. And yet, it's not appropriate to just measure them statistically either, because that's what you do when you have a whole mass of information that's all kind of related, and you measure the waves and modulation in it. Living systems are all connected internally. Everything connects to everything else. And the variables are many, but they're not infinite. So you need to know them. And the way to learn about them, she says, is to think about processes. And then to work inductively, to work from the particulars toward the general. Don't start with a rule like it has to be this. You get cookie cutter development that way. Start from the pieces and see what they tell you. So do your observation, look at what's there, and then try to intuit what's not there, and see what that thing is that's in front of you. And then look for, she says, clues, very small quantities that indicate larger processes. In other words, she's tapping into the fractal nature of living reality. That a small, scattering of pollen on the surface of the soil can tell you what's going on with much larger energy processes. So I encourage all of you to read the original. It's wonderful. It's not that long. Jane Jacobs. She's passed about a year or two, 3, 4 years ago now. She wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961. You can probably pick up a paperback of it for 50 cents or find it in the library. Chapter 22 is a disquisition on permaculture epistemology.
I'd like the opportunity to hear how you have cultivated your ability to connect with the intuitive, how you have personally done that. How did you cultivate that?
By making a lot of mistakes from not listening to myself. And letting that learning somehow penetrate my being. And then every now and then surrendering to, for no reason that I can understand, I can do that or not do that.
So do you follow up with asking, have I made a mistake here? And then gaze into that person?
Yes, I look at where I've made mistakes, and then I try to reflect back and see if I at some point in that process knew better before the mistake occurred.
In the design process, to answer that question specifically, what I'm doing at reaching a point where I'm trying to create ideas is I pay particular attention to the visions that flow through my head, capture them, and do it in a non-judgmental fashion. You don't judge it when they're going through or they'll stop going through. When you see a vision, capture it somehow with a word, a sketch, whatever, and then let those coalesce into a design.
I believe it's very important that we each cultivate our own muse and our own access to vision, but it is also possible to tap group intelligence in this way through brainstorming other ideational processes, because we all hold a piece of the truth. We all have some facet of it. And if we are willing to simply stimulate the group to put that up and plaster it on the wall, then stop a moment and reflect on it, we will begin to see what emerges. Patterns will emerge. We can take those ideas and order them, and we'll see the outliers and the central pieces. Jillian.
I'm really appreciating this discussion, and I'm loving the way that you're framing not only the pattern language, but the process of design. Because I find that in teaching, this is one of the trickiest parts, because people want to jump to more or less a definitive solution way prematurely. And I think that even in a full 2-week design course, we're really only beginning the design process. And I think we do more of a service to allow loops and the intuitive body to play there rather than get to a definitive solution or something like that. And one thing I wanted to mention in the PDC panel yesterday, but we ran out of time, is a pattern that I'm using, especially for urban courses where we go to a lot of different sites, is silent observation at every single site we go to. So we're not in the kind of like disconnected, okay, now I'm going to stand and receive a speech, but it's activated, going and looking and thinking and drawing and feeling. Because I think part of our responsibility is to make that quality space, to develop, what would have been our, our natural heritage that we've become disconnected.
This bears back on Roxanne's question. The access to the intuition comes first in silence, quieting the mind, if you will, because the intuitions, if you will, are coming not through the linear discerning language centers. They're filtering across the corpus callosum from the right brain. They're picked up here all the time. We just don't listen to the signals mostly. We all have essentially infinite intelligence available to us, but we're filtered down from it. We're way shut down from it. So it becomes a process of quieting this conventional, whatever brainwave stuff activity it is. So get a little dreamy. Ben says go out, sit down on a log, and start to fall asleep. And in that liminal space in between sleep and waking, those thoughts will come unfiltered. They may not even be whole statements. They might be fragment images, or they might have a word, or there might be a sound. You don't know what it's going to be, but it'll come in.
That's where the magic comes.
That's where the magic comes in. I named you, so I'll have to give you a little moment here.
Thank you. What I'd like to add to that is, without even looking at a design, is that 0, 0. Where are the edges in something personal, and cultivate the ability to move into that mysterious in zone 0, 0, and then you'll experience that in yourselves and say, I'm feeling that in this design. You're cultivating that in everything you do. I draw Celtic knots on my name tag. That's the way I keep honing that skill.
Good. I see you right that you've spoken. Let me get this gentleman here.
So, a common pattern that I've observed with designers who are starting to have some success, is so they've gotten into the pattern language, they've adapted it, they're into the process, they use it, and some of the best designs come out of work from relatively inexperienced designers who have got some work, and then they really tie into these patterns, and then they'll have quite a successful project or a series of successful projects, and then they start repeating those patterns, and they lose their observational skills, and then it's the same thing, or the kind of quality starts to go down, and then so kind of, if you can, concretely, I mean, the answer to how not to do that is inherent in what everyone's been saying, but if you can concretely, do you have some mechanisms or some techniques for avoiding that?
Break up your process pattern a little bit, deliberately. Work with different partners.
Do something that scares you.
You know, go at the thing from a different direction in the way you start. Don't be always in the same routines. I hear what you're saying, and it becomes a strength. Habit holds us up, keeps us from falling down, gets our teeth brushed every day. But we need some way to not get in a rut. I guess this is what you're saying. You know, we can keep repeating and cranking out similar kinds of things in response to it.
The simpler way to say it is, you know, I'll see a burrow. I can see that from 500 feet away.
Yes.
And most of the time, I just, oh, it's a burrow. And I haven't thought about it at all in terms of the branch pattern or, you know, scarring or anything like that. I just know it's a burrow.
What else it might be telling you? The history of fire or
right.
Any of those things, yes. Well, time and willingness to enter into intimate relation with the landscape or the observed. Bob.
One of the things that I think we need a pattern language for is change, how we make societies change. And we really need a bunch of patterns, because I think one of the patterns that a lot of people think they use is a contagion pattern. It's an idea that I put this idea down in the middle of some place and it's going to spread. And people are resistant to it spreading. I mean, so it is a contagion, but some people are resistant. And another kind of pattern is a schooling pattern. We're going to have a class, and people are going to learn in the class. And some people are resistant to classes. I mean, they haven't had good experiences with classes, and so on. But we ought to examine the tools we're using to change things. And I could go on with some more of that.
Because we need to model change, because change is so acutely important right now. Adam?
Yeah, just to play off that, I mean, Peter expressed some skepticism about applying pattern languages to non-physical things, to processes, but that also we need to try and start to go there. And that's a lot of the work that I've been doing, and I know a lot of other people at this convergence are starting to do, is look at invisible structures and applying this framework to that. And I think that, that's something that I'm personally going to be working on more and more over the next several years and releasing. And I've already heard several other people at this conference working on those kinds of things. So I think those processes are starting, and anybody that's interested in continuing and collaborating on that work, come find us.
Social patterns or invisible structures do have shape.
Yes.
So how do we translate it?
Can we see the shapes?
Right.
Amongst all the chaos of what we're presented with. That's much of the challenge of identifying patterns. They're there, we're not tuned to them. And especially in the social world, we've got so many other signals coming in. It's easy to ignore, it's easy to get on some other narrative and not actually see what objectively is going on in the essence. Scott.
I just wanted to comment about, getting into ruts as a designer. I really like the use of the random assembly tool when I feel like I'm sort of not able to dream big enough to kind of force myself into another pattern of thinking about what I'm doing. So I think it's an incredible tool. The other thing that frustrates me is that the impoverishment of English. There's so many descriptors that have been lost. And I find myself digging through 17th century poetry to try and find where's the word that describes that, because I feel often I can't see it if I can't describe it. It's like sort of a blindness that happens. And I particularly struggle with that when I'm trying to deal with orders. What is the limiting orders of these different things that don't have names?
At one time, our society had names for most of that.
That's right.
And
we lived in it.
We lived in it. We threw them away or dropped them. On the subject of ruts, I think it occurs to me that any time we can shift toward play, we can interrupt a rut. So the random assembly is being fanciful, effectively. So give yourself permission to play in the context of doing the design work, and new things will emerge. Seth.
Yeah, I want to talk about the rut thing also. I talked to some people here today, or this weekend, about my 10 years I lived in Brazil for about a decade. So they have Carnival, which some people know a lot about, some people don't. Carnival is the anti-time.
Carnival is
the anti-time. Regular time stops. Yes. All the regular patterns cease. You do all the stuff you would never do for a month or two. And I mean all the stuff you would never do for a month or two. And then you go back to real time and go back to your job. Yeah. And it's this whole resetting every year. You compost all that stuff from last year in your head. You end the magic. And when the anti-time, you break all the patterns you can follow.
Yes, you break all the rules.
And I've seen it here, like in Burning Man, it's very close to trade for me. Even this convergence, we go through tons of patterns, in our behaviors and our thoughts and our lives out there. We'll go back to it and try and remember what's going on here. And then we'll come back to another convergence because we need this anti-space.
They have a name for that pattern. It's called a temporary autonomous zone. And it means that there's a suspension of all expectations or rules as long as, you don't infringe on someone else's life or liberty. And it allows a space to open up and contain whatever's going to happen within that realm.
On that note, the container, that means to be healthy, you need to have a safe place to do that.
Yes,
And
containers
that's
and
part
pattern
of what our
itself.
job is, to make a safe place.
We're often providing that. I would argue that the permaculture design course is in some ways a temporary autonomous zone, and that we as teachers have the obligation to create a safe container for psychological and spiritual transformation as well as new information.
I think what you're proposing here with the pattern language is really critical, especially as we transition from fossil fuel patterns, which Walmart is a pattern language. you know, and it's the result of cheap fossil fuel. And if we look at a lot of the design professions, whether it's planning, my background was industrial design, you can see how they develop pattern languages from fossil fuel, but how do we start to train more people in their ecosystems, you know, which is what permaculture is doing, to be able to develop their own ecotone pattern language and replicate it at a quicker rate, which allows quicker adoption, basically.
Well, I resonate with what Scott said. I'm always wanting to reach deep into the language and the cultural roots, because I think there's a lot of treasure there that got discarded along the path, and we can reclaim some of it, even if only through the words initially, and then we can put form and life to those words. It's not the only way, but we have to get people to live in those new realities, and then we'll come to understand their organic order. I'm interested in hearing from people who haven't spoken, so please.
Yeah, and I missed the beginning of your talk, so if I repeat anything
patterns recur.
There you go. I am reading Christopher Alexander's follow-up book, The Phenomenon of Life,
Yes.
which is, I mean, I am so inspired by that, where he has taken different, specifically architectural, but you can take it into anything, and compared different structures. So the one that really stuck with me was the slum house in Bangkok, but compared to a highly stylized postmodern architectural house. And he asked the question, which has more life? Now, how do you define life? Life is in that space that we've talked about, this mysterious place, this place that you can feel with other senses besides your five senses. And I think that is such an important aspect to keep in mind when you're designing, is does this feel like it's adding life or taking life? And we can feel that. We can feel that in the utmost essence of our being, and to really ask that question when we're designing, am I adding life? And he identifies patterns that bring life versus not bring life, like scale is one of them. If you miss
Boundaries
the scale,
and strong centers
right.
and good shape and alternating
so
repetition and the void. And yes, he identifies 15 fundamental qualities that living environments exhibit. And so I'm asking us to stop pretending that we don't know what's alive.
Yeah.
To remember that we are alive and we know what else is alive, and to do the next step to be responsible to that knowledge and self-awareness, and to learn, if you will, the patterns or the rules for creating life. Alexander says, build it and they will come. To borrow the popular phrase, he says life grows out of form. The right form gives rise to life. So we who shape environments are purposely aiming to create more life in the world. How we shape those environments gives rise to more or less life. Let's learn to do it in the way that moves and meets our aims.
The thing about life is what that gentleman was talking about earlier just now. I think life is also about connection. Something that's living has connection to everything else that's not separated from it. And what you said about how we do that, and that's also design there. And that's also because it happens to be a visual process that goes on. And the PVC is sort of like an initiation. And that's what we have. So that's what you see is the initiation. This there has to be that physical process. This hasn't been moved. But when it's already has happened, it's started. When it's been started, you guys have been laying around for decades.
Thank you. Who else? Someone else? Who else?
We talked a little bit about mistakes. How are you identifying mistakes? What informs you as to what mistakes are?
The question is, how do you know what's a mistake?
Isn't there a pattern? Humble inquiry? Goals aren't met. Humble inquiry as a pattern?
Humble inquiry. Well, yes. it doesn't produce abundance. It leads to further entropy or decay, or generates conflict, perhaps. I mean, sometimes that's necessary, but so it's not always a mistake to generate conflict, but those are some of the indicators. What?
The problem is not being
The problem
solved.
is not solved. Sometimes it's something that starts out looking like a mistake leads to being a great catalyst for a positive outcome. So our job is to know where we are and which order we're in. Are we in the small level order of, oh, I blundered, or we're in the large level order of, oh, I opened up a box and in the box is a treasure. So that's our job as designers, is to know where we are in the order of inquiry too.
I like that piece where you said, where you feel like you didn't listen to yourself, when you feel back.
Yeah. It's often relatively easy to admit, to see that. It's a little bit like humiliating, but it's there, you know. It's like, oh, I know that. I noticed that moment, that very moment when I knew I was going to cut my finger, and it hadn't happened yet. I could have put the knife down. Ben, please.
So these pattern languages are so reminiscent to me of indigenous mythology. It's just that we lay them out in textbooks rather than weaving the actual pieces of the language into a story. George Gurdjieff, who was an Eastern European mystic, came up with this term called a legomenism, which is like a functional piece of objective art that had information encoded in it. But what he says is that the only way that somebody can access that information is if they have the cultural keys. So I'm wondering, what are, like, we as a community are coming up with these pattern languages. What are the keys? Like, do our languages need some kind of like initiatory entry point to be understood?
I think the languages have to be embodied to be understood. I think the keys are in the garden, or in the home, or on the street. And we have to get people into the environments that are alive, that we help to create. There may be initiatory keys also, there may be other ways, but I think fundamentally these come alive when they're embodied. They make sense to people who are willing to live into them. And how do we lead that?
Even like as simply as in your book, like your pattern language in your book made so much sense to me because I've read John Jevons and I've read Fukuoka and I studied Amelia Hazlitt. But is there a way that even in a book we could just have like maybe in your list of what a pattern language needs, maybe it just needs like a little set of resources. Like if you want to understand this pattern language better, this is the foundation that you need.
That's good. I hope I placed some of those markers early in the text and in the fine print. But yes, I take that suggestion to heart.
Great. One little side note, I said that you're developing a really great pattern language, and I see Toby in the audience, and I think his book is a really great pattern language for the mass public, just as represented by the way that it's influenced a lot of the public. I meet people who read his book and get permaculture in a sense, and it's translating this language into, to use Indian terms, a householder or Vishnu type, translation rather than Brahma, which is the creator, Shiva is the destroyer. But really, most people are householders. I live in Cincinnati, and you have Kroger's and Macy's and Procter & Gamble, which develop these products for Middle America. And it's like, how do we translate this back, bring Middle America back into sustainable lifestyles again? So.
It's 1/7 of the problems in the world. It's a big one because of the ecological impact. I think that's important. It's not the only set of problems permaculture is attempting to address. Lee.
I teach dowsing as a form of applied intuition, and there's simple techniques that can help you tap into your subconscious and superconsciousness. So I'm doing an open space at 3, and it's a quest, and you can develop a simple system to tap in and develop trust, and after that it flows.
Where are you meeting?
It's going to be under one of the tents over here. It's posted out here, about 3 o'clock.
Lee is a great translator of this invisible knowledge. I highly encourage you to take advantage.
I've been an art educator for many years, and I teach patterns in nature as part of my courses, and really sharpening skills of observation. But translating all these really complex concepts and language into a visual sense, I think is really important for us as designers to have a very clear way of putting, all these patterns of time, soil, all these layers in a way that people can understand. People who don't really know much about permaculture design, something that's accessible. I think arts sometimes give more accessibility where language can be too complex.
My own training in permaculture was greatly strengthened by the cartooning that Lee Harrison did with a blackboard, simple forms to express essential ideas. And I've regretted the gradual disappearance of blackboards from classrooms. For a while, whiteboards are a poor substitute. They don't have the same feel. In any case, I agree with you that we need to be able to draw, and every one of us can draw. We were all artists at 5. There's no reason we couldn't be artists. You had your hand up. You have something important to say.
Could you stand up?
Stand up.
Well, the first day, Friday, Fridays, one of the speakers mentioned fine tuners. And that's a very good, when I was a young girl, I read that. And it was one of the first things that opened me up. So, the other thing I read as an adult that has helped me to Isabel, let me jump around. Isabel yesterday, I don't know her last name, she mentioned that children and people that aren't in tune with what's going on in nature, or their surroundings, or what the possibilities that they hold within that. You start with small things. It's like when you teach a child, or you rear a child, and you see them progress and grow and evolve. I see that, and Edward Wilson, Gail Wilson, who is a very, very good person. He has taken the simple life of an ant, and I guess I'm trying to compare that in what he studied, how important ant is to the whole ecology of the world. And if you can express that with children, clients, anyone that you pass by, and just start with that one simple thing. It starts a story. And so just to put those things together, and quiet mind. Quiet mind is very important.
Quiet mind.
Quiet mind first.
Quiet mind.
And energies will flow and spread.
The understanding beneath the ant, behind the ant, the example of the ant, is that the ant is connected to everything in the ecosystem. And so are we. And so is everything else. And so the teaching opportunities are endless. And the humblest are sometimes the easiest to convey. Scott.
I'm remembering what the permaculture design course is to me. And to me, in many ways, it's just a mnemonic for remembering. It is that it's so loaded with cues. That's why I'm terrified when people say, oh, let's leave this out, because I'm saying, wait a minute, that's, the crown of the tree. But I think that mnemonic, we're carrying an incredible knowledge. And part of it is because it helps people remember who they are as human beings, where they belong, and everything we've been discussing and that Peter has presented. It's all there. So
I agree. Don't lose any of the parts. First rule of tinkering.
One of the things that I like to get across when I teach patterns is, for one thing, how good we are at it, how wired we are for pattern recognition, and how terrific we are at it. But it's a mixed blessing, because it also means that we impose pattern on anything, whether that pattern is actually functioning or not. And so one of the lessons that I'm getting in this phase of my life is it doesn't necessarily look like what you think it looks like. I'm finding all these blessings in my life that are arriving. I keep saying, I want this, and then realizing, oh wait, I've already got it. That just to describe that in a little bit of a story, that I prefer to be a passenger in a car rather than a driver, and my wife likes to be a driver, so that's great. I'm a passenger, and we were riding around one day, and I said to her, my dream is if I were really rich, I'd sit in the back of the limousine, and I'd be able to read, and I'd have a driver to take me places, and do whatever I want. And she looks at me from the driver's seat and says, Toby, you already have a driver. And it kind of just opened my eyes to all the things that I have in my life that just they don't look like what I have a community. It's just not, I'm not living in Pinhorn, that's all. So I just encourage us all to be much more open to the patterns that are already there and already in process, and to learn from them rather than being
offer up another resource in this conversation. Mark Williams out of North Carolina wrote a really wonderful book called Botany in a Day, which goes through a pattern of understanding.
He didn't write it.
Oh,
Thomas Elbow.
Thomas Elbow wrote it. He's been handing out and producing it in the last couple of years. But that book is really wonderful because it walks you through the pattern of being able to start engaging with different parts of ecology. There's an awful lot inside of it in regards to how to approach it, as well as there are a lot of patterns inside of patterns inside of patterns. If you look at plants that are inherent inside of sacred geometry, and I'm hearing in this conversation a lot of talk about invisible structures, and I think another part to patterns conversation are the patterns of spirituality and our collective sociological background that we have as a people. So I just would like to encourage folks to look at patterns of spirituality in conjunct with patterns of ecology itself, as they are very, very connected. It's Botany in a Day.
Mark Williams has a website called Botany Every Day.
Botany Every Day.
And he uses the book for his class.
You can take an online course, he guides you throughout the year.
Botany in a Day was written by Thomas Epple,
I think it
E-L-P-E-L.
may be in for sale. I think it may be for sale. One of the best things I ever heard. Yeah, it's true.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I feel I've accomplished my objective, which was to roil the waters. So we're free to do what we like at this point.